Not too long ago, I made a video talking about the weirdest classes in Fire Emblem history, and when I was wrapping it up, a thought hit me. If all these unusual classes ended up in the final game, then what must the classes that didn't look like? And so I took a dive into the world of cut classes in Fire Emblem, and today I resurface bearing information for you all. Let's not waste any more time and get the party started in Valentia. Shadow Dragon has no unused classes we know of, so instead we begin by looking at Gaiden. I won't pretend this is a treasure trove, it's just two names that were meant for classes left in the game's code, but it's still two interesting ones. The first was without a doubt meant to be another monster species, which Gaiden already has a lot of, the Serpent. Like I said, we don't know anything more than that, but that this would have probably been some kind of large snake is safe to assume. The second is easily the more interesting one, Naga, as in the character my channel is named after. The monarch of the divine dragons, as she or he, that is not consistent, appears in several Fire Emblem games. In fact, I feel like the intention with this character is for it to be some kind of divine being that constantly appears with different identities and in different ways. Sometimes it's a man, like in the older Arcania titles. Sometimes it's a scantily clad woman, like in Heroes, of course. But to give Heroes some credit, this is the game that actually builds up this idea of Naga the most. She or they literally say, I appear before man in many forms, sometimes a great hero, sometimes a helpless child, further indicating Naga can really be anything. Except for a class in Gaiden, apparently. What kind of role they would have played is very hard to say, since the character is not mentioned in Gaiden, or Shadows of Valentia for that matter, at all. While Shadow Dragon did not have any cut classes for us to look at, Mystery of the Emblem actually does. The first of these is one that seems to have had a significant story purpose. The Dark Knight was a cavalry unit wearing all black and using lances. As such, there is no relation to the class of the same name that was introduced in Awakening, which is a cavalry unit but uses tomes and swords. Instead, this class was probably meant to be exclusive to Camus, who has a dark color scheme and is definitely a character worthy of his own unique class. Another lance user that didn't end up in the final game is the Guardian class. It appears the purpose of this class was to be a counterpart to an armored knight, with high resistance instead of defense. Guardians would eventually appear as a monster unit in Shadows of Valentia, but with completely different stats, and it's also not likely these enemies would have been monsters instead of regular soldiers had they appeared in Mystery of the Emblem. A class I don't think would have been a regular soldier is the Sea Dragon. Mystery of the Emblem already has a lot of dragon enemies, but it appears another was planned that resembled some sort of sea serpent. Just like pirates, it would have been able to cross water tiles, and there is even some evidence that suggests we may have been able to use it ourselves. A sea dragonstone exists in the code, albeit merely as a word rather than a functional item, suggesting Manicheets may at one point have been able to turn into one. Well, so far we have seen a very diverse and unique set of cut classes. Going into Jugdral, the type of unused classes is definitely different. For some reason, Genealogy of the Holy War has a ton of quite normal and tame unused classes. Take the Soldier for example. It's an absolute series staples I would say, but it doesn't appear in FE4 and is merely left in the game data unused. Considering it's able to use any type of melee weapon and doesn't have a specific one assigned, it seems it didn't get very far before getting axed. This is further supported by the existence of the unused Sword Soldier, Axe Soldier and Spear Soldier classes, which are basically the same thing except now with their titular weapon as their only option. Archers also end up unused in Genealogy of the Holy War, replaced in the final game by the slightly different but obviously very similar Bow Knights. The final cut class of Genealogy of the Holy War seems to mirror the situation we saw earlier with Camus. Black Knights were supposed to appear in this game as a similar class to Great Knights, except black in color scheme and using lances instead of axes. This concept art is the only remnant that exists of this class, but it is speculated it was meant to be used for certain bosses, like Schmidt, who are Great Knights with black color schemes in the final game. Freyja 776 was built on the foundation laid in Genealogy of the Holy War, and they can also be seen in their cut classes. Night Lords, Master Knights, Killer Ballistas, Dragon Masters, Falcon Knights, and the story-relevant classes Emperor and Dark Prince all debuted in Genealogy of the Holy War, but are not used in Freyja, and so are just left in the code, while all of their roles were taken up by new classes. They're essentially just leftovers, so they're not the most interesting group to zoom in on. Fortunately, when we get to the GBA era, that changes. The Binding Blade may not have many unused classes, the ones that do exist are interesting, and may point towards characters that never came to be. Both the Mercenary and Paladin classes are essentially gender locked in the game, since all characters that can be them are male. And yet, in the code, evidence exists for female mercenaries and paladins that go unused. The Blazing Blade would expand this list even further, keeping traces of female druids, heroes, shamans and myrmidons, all of which don't appear in the final game. Now, I do think I must clarify this is probably another Freyja situation, because female characters of these classes may not appear in the Blazing Blade, but they do in Binding Blade. The same cannot be said about a trio of truly cut classes, which appear to have been primitive versions of the classes used for Lyn, Eliwood and Hector. In the final game they are all lords, but with wildly different interpretations of the same class, and perhaps that was what these cut classes had to prevent. We have the Lycian Swordfighter for Lyn, the Lycian Knight for Eliwood and Lycian Armor Knight for Hector. This is further strengthened by the fact that the map sprites for these unused classes are the sprites for our three main characters. No functional stats or other information exists for these classes, so we can't compare them to what we got in the final product, but I still think it's interesting the lords were originally planned to each have their own unique class title. The Sacred Stones only has one cut class to talk about, but it is a very interesting one, the Probation Flyer. It appears in an early demo of the game and originates from a time where Emilia was still a very prominent character and Princess of Frelia, basically Tana's role. This class has the map sprite of a Falcon Knight but the battle animations of a Pegasus Knight, and in a very unusual twist for a flying class, extremely limited movement, no more than any unit on foot. Combine this with the character it was meant for, and I can't help but speculate whether the idea once was to combine the recruit idea with a royal character, using the lackluster movement to represent Emilia was still a budding talent. Just like the Binding Blade, Path of Radiance 2 has female counterparts for classes that are exclusively used by men in the final game. Both Cavaliers and Bishops fall in this category. What is quite noteworthy is that the design of this female bishop looks like a less detailed version of Valencia, and is used in scenes where she appears before she gets her Pegasus. It's also used for Sanaki in the same way. Volk is the only assassin that ends up actually used in Path of Radiance, but evidence in the data suggests this was at one point meant to be an enemy usable class as well. There's even a female equivalent present, but it wasn't worked on much. Something similar happened with Herons. As you probably know, according to the story of Tellius, only royal herons still exist, and yet generic enemy herons are found in the code with nearly finished models and all. Very unfinished battle data also exists for black dragons, which would eventually become a class in Radiant Dawn, but did already exist in Tellius as it appears in Path of Radiance. It's never seen in gameplay, although it was as such planned to appear, but probably scrapped very early on. Radiant Dawn itself doesn't have any cut classes to speak of, so instead we continue to the DS, where we find Shadow Dragon's remake to actually have some unused classes, unlike the original title. It's not much, but it is very interesting. Still left in the game's data is a version of Cavaliers that were able to dismount. This command debuted in Mystery of the Emblem, so the fact it was considered when we return to Arcania isn't that strange, but when looking at its place in the series as a whole, it very much is. Dismounting last appeared in Freyja 776 at this point in time, so it had been absent for quite a while and would remain absent too, because despite being a remake of Mystery of the Emblem, new Mystery of the Emblem doesn't offer the option to dismount at all. It would eventually reappear at Free Houses after multiple decades of absence, but the fact it was considered for another appearance right in the middle of that long period is quite noteworthy, I'd say. Going forward into the era of the 3DS, the number of classes and options to reclass would absolutely explode, and that might have played a role in the lack of cut classes as a whole. In fact, if we're being strict, this has been all of them. Awakening, Fates, Shadows of Valentia, Free Houses and Engage all do not have unused classes we know of, but that doesn't mean the video ends here. Because there is still class relevant content that ended up on the cutting room floor. A very interesting one is courtesy of Awakening. While this game didn't introduce skills, it most certainly opened the floodgates of freedom using them, and one remnant from a time when that may not have always been planned still remains in the code. Dance is an unused skill found in Awakening that does exactly as you would think. It allows units to dance. This was originally how Olivia would be able to perform this command, but in the final game it isn't a skill, it's simply a class-bound command instead. This was possibly done to prevent you from being able to make any and everyone a dancer, which could hint towards this cut skill being older than the inheriting system. Fates too has some cut skills, although I won't pretend they're as interesting as Dance. Armor Shield and Beast Shield would have protected armored and beast units against weapons that strike them for effective damage. Why this was cut is hard to say, especially since Awakening already introduced EOT Shield as a skill to protect flyers against effective damage. Fates doesn't have that skill though, so at least it's fair across the board. Since Shadows of Valentia and Engage truly have nothing to talk about in this context, the last game we'll be looking at today is Free Houses. Free class names are found in the data that are not used in the final game. As classes, that is, because their titles actually do appear. These are the King of Wings, King of Fangs and King of Beasts, all of which are names for demonic beasts fought during auxiliary battles throughout the game. It appears that once upon a time, this trio may have been planned to be unique enemies rather than generic ones with unique names. I feel like I should probably also mention that there is leftover data in the code for a playable Lady Rhea, which would have made her unique class, Archbishop, which now only appears as an enemy and green unit, playable. Sophis and Gerald were also planned to be playable it seems, but their classes are listed as Commoner, which is clearly just a default that was supposed to be changed, hadn't they not been cut. But especially with Sophis, it's likely she would have also received her own unique class, although she is a Gramarye when played in Free Hopes. And that has been every cut class Fire Emblem has ever seen. Which one would you have liked to see in the final game? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on all my future Fire Emblem content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.